Okay, it's 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. Oh, these blue light glasses, super reflective. Hi, hope you guys are doing well. So the plan for today, since we went through the entire slide deck on Tuesday's lecture, I spent the majority of this morning before my nutrition class designing a activity for us to do. Surprisingly, it was very hard to find models for like a histology case study or histology activity that wasn't just looking at images of different types of tissues and identifying them, which I don't think would be a useful or would be a good use and effective use of our lecture time, since we have slides in lab that you guys are welcome to look at whenever we're in there. So I put together a little case study assignment, and I'm going to publish this when we get to actually getting you guys into your groups to work on it. So this is going to function very similarly to what we did last Thursday, where I'm going to set up breakout rooms, and you'll automatically randomly be assigned to a breakout room, and you guys as a group will work together to answer some questions. And so the case study document looks like this. Each group will have their own Google document that you can go to. The grade for this is for simply being here and participating. And so to get full credit, when you're in your breakout rooms, you must have your video on and be communicating with your group mates. If there's some reason that you are unable to have your video on, which I understand there are likely many reasonable reasons, please just reach out to me so that you don't lose that credit. But yeah, so the case study looks like this. We have 3 different parts to it. And each part is designed to provide you with a little bit of information at a time and have you answer questions, make assumptions, apply your knowledge based on that info as you work through. So really important that you don't read ahead or skip to part 2 while you're still working on part 1, because that will influence your thinking and assumptions. And so this will kind of be a test run for us on this kind of assignment. This is the type of thing I want to include more and more of in my lecture content for this course. Because I think if anything from this class, probably the most important thing you can do is practice applying the knowledge that we are gaining to novel situations, since that most of you are going into some sort of medical track within this by taking this course. And that's what your day-to-day will be, right? Applying the knowledge that you already have based on limited information, etc., or determining what other information you need to find, right? Those kinds of things. So again, there's 3 parts, just work 1 part at a time. Each breakout room will have their own document to work on. The way I suggest you guys progress through this is that 1 student in your breakout room should share their screen, and they will be the one collecting like answers or thoughts, and you guys can come together to decide on how you want to respond to these questions. So you can have the document up on your own screen as well, but just have 1 student in each group, in each room, sharing their screen, and that will be the person typing your guys' answers. I will come around and check in on you. There's also the request help option in Zoom while you're in your breakout rooms that'll ping me, letting me know that you guys have a question or are having some difficulty. And so we'll see how long this takes. I would assume we'll have some time towards the end, hopefully 20 to 30 minutes, where we can talk as a class about this case study and what you guys thought, and if any of that info conflicts with what you thought from lecture, etc. So that's the plan. So what do you guys think? Any questions or concerns? Does everyone feel confident in how we're going to progress through this? Okay, I'll take a lack of responses as everyone feels okay. And hopefully that's what it means. So like I said, this will be us kind of testing this as a useful thing for during lecture. And so from this point on throughout the quarter, if we have weeks where we're supposed to cover a chapter over 2 days, and we get to go through all of that chapter content on the first day, at the end of class, I will send out like a poll in Zoom before you guys leave to ask if you would prefer working on stuff like this, doing another kind of case study activity, or if you'd prefer just like a day for review and reflection to answer questions. So yeah, that's how we'll progress on this. So I'm going to go ahead and make your breakout rooms. Or let me show you where you can find the links. So there is this histology case study in-class assignment that should now pop up for you in Module 4. I'm also going to send the links to each of these pages in the chat. But if you open it up, it just has the individual Google documents for each breakout room. And again, just one person from each room needs to share their screen for everyone to see and write their answers on. So again, I'm about to make the breakout rooms. I know some students came in as I was explaining what's happening. Hopefully you'll get into a group that was here for the whole explanation, but I will also come around to catch you guys up. So last chance for questions before you get these invites.
So is this the type of format that we will be tested on?
So no, you won't, like on the exam, sorry, let me collect my thoughts before I respond to that. This is an example of a much more intensive application type of question, right, where you're going through multiple stages. On an exam, you would get like all the information up front that you would need for one response or two responses. So yes, on an exam, I might look for the ability to apply information, right, or assess that skill, but it would not be in this format with like so many questions and separate information being provided at a time. Does that fully answer your question, or is that still unclear? It's okay.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, we have 13 students here, so we'll do 4 breakout rooms. Should be groups of 3. I'm about to create them and send them out. So once you get your invite, you can go in. Your breakout room number correlates with a specific document. You can go through here, but I'm also going to share these links once you're in your room. So good luck, everybody, and I'll see you when I see you. Resume recording. Okay. So before we jump into it or jump into specifics, generally, how did you guys feel about this?
Real good.
Real good. Cool.
Yeah, I liked it. I thought it was a fun way to like apply what we learned.
Awesome. Cool. Oh, great. Yeah, and you probably noticed I jumped in onto your document and added that 4th question. So technically the instructions at the beginning were a lie or inaccurate. There are now 9 questions in there asking for some feedback. And any feedback is appreciated. So I know if I should continue putting effort and time into this kind of stuff. So let's jump into it. Should have put more thought into how I want to go through this. Let's see. So what were you guys thinking from part 1, right? So you were given the general scenario going on here. You're introduced to Flo, gave some what might have seemed irrelevant at the time, extra info about her as far as being 6 foot tall by the time she was 12 years old and reaching 6'5" by 17, which is part of that Marfan syndrome. And then just identified for you that Flo's autopsy identified an aortic aneurysm as the cause of death. And although cardiovascular stress or intense activity, such as being a professional athlete, would involve a lot of cardiovascular stress, it is extremely uncommon for the aorta to essentially burst like that. And typically is related to cigarette usage or cholesterol regulating medications. So at this point in the case study, what did you guys think was going on? What kinds of tissues were you thinking were involved? And how did you come to those conclusions?
At the beginning, for me, I thought that there was cardiac tissue in play because it's the heart, right? So I figured that there were some, but then at the end, it seemed like it wasn't included. So I guess not.
Yeah, it is technically separate from the heart as far as there is not cardiac muscle as a part of that aorta. It is more similar to the structure of your blood vessels in general. And it's just a larger valve or vessel for the blood to pump through as it leaves the aorta or as it leaves the heart. and the aorta is also supposed to contract and dilate in order to keep blood moving out, or in the in the one direction it's supposed to be traveling, so not traveling backwards. But yes, structurally much more similar to a blood vessel than the actual chambers of the heart.
So you would see the cardiac muscle more in like the body of the heart rather than like those shoot offs.
Yes. And that is the only place you will find your cardiac muscle. Well, cool. Thank you, Deacon. Any other input that you guys want to share about what you were thinking during part one? Okay. Let's talk general strategies when you guys were addressing this info. How were groups going about trying to determine answers for things like what kind of tissue might be involved and generating your hypotheses? What kind of strategies were you guys using?
I know for our group, you have to, kind of think about, well, is it a cavity of the body? Probably, because it's one of the organs. So you'll definitely see some kind of epithelial tissue there. And then we know the heart is a muscle and it's not a muscle we control. And so that's why I said cardiac muscle, but my group members said that they were smooth and they were correct. And then, something has to hold it all together. And so I think that's where connective tissue comes into play.
Awesome. Yeah. And that's great reasoning. Thank you again, Deacon. Ariel, were you about to share how your group?
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing. We kind of all like Ben took the lead and he was focused on his, and we were all focused on our own, but then when we got to the end, we were all kind of right in what we were talking about. But yeah, the epithelial, my Beza kept saying it's the epithelial. We're like, oh, we don't know. And then Ben was like, but it's the elastin, the connective. And then I was like, but muscular. But by the time we got to the end, yeah, we were all like, there's 3 tissues that make up the heart. And even like as we're going through, the case study, like we all had, I was looking at your notes. I was looking at your PowerPoint. He was looking at the notes. She was looking in the book. So we were all like using different resources to get to the answer.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you for sharing as well. So yeah, what you both described that your groups were, or how your groups were approaching these was how I intended and what I was hoping for you guys to do. So that's awesome. I felt like with how I was discussing it, or how I was sharing and how we were discussing it on Tuesday, like I introduced that epithelial tissue is going to be lining any of the cavities, and introduced that connective tissue is under that epithelial tissue, but we didn't really discuss what a full like segment of tissue might look like, or all the layers and how they might overlap with things. So really wanted to bring that kind of thinking into this. I was glad that I could find questions to try to address that, because it is end to end, right? There's going to be stuff in between, epithelial on both sides of any kind of lining like that, connective tissue layers under both of those things, and then muscle or other types of connective tissue in between, okay? Including bone and blood as connective tissue. So don't forget that those count as connective tissue. So cool, great. So yeah, part one was really just trying to come up with some conclusion based on very limited information. Moving on to part two, introduce the genetic analysis. So there is a gene strongly correlated with what we now know is called Marfan's disease. And so the gene is FBN1, named for the fibrillin protein that it is responsible for expressing. And then a mutation in that gene typically will lead to either less production of that fibrillin protein or dysfunction of those fibrillin proteins. So the amino acids being added to that protein are going to change because there was a change to the genetic code, and thus the resulting protein might not function the way it's supposed to. And so we also introduced, besides the function of fibrillin within connective tissue being part of that microfibril network, fibrillin is also responsible for, or plays a large role in, inhibiting and controlling the expression of the growth factor TGF-beta. And so fibrillin is supposed to inhibit it and sequester it, meaning reducing the activity of that growth factor. And so if fibrillin isn't functioning the way it's supposed to, that growth factor will be released in higher amounts or travel through the body in higher amounts than it's supposed to. And since growth factors stimulate cell replication, differentiation, and some of them, like TGFB, help with stimulating apoptosis whenever there are mutations or malfunctions, having a lot of this growth factor could lead to some other malfunctions beyond just the connective tissue being a problem, right? And from what I can see on most of your pages, you guys were thinking through that kind of stuff. Some of you guys were starting to think about that growth part and how that might lead to other things, connecting it back to the fact that she was 6 foot tall by 12 and 6'5" by 17, right, with some abnormal skeleton growth. And so I was really glad to see that kind of thinking present in all the groups. And so then getting to part 3 gave the full explanation of this syndrome. So again, this is Marfan syndrome. And there's a lot of common symptoms related to that come from that excessive growth in general because of the TGFB growth hormone and issues with your connective tissue. So lower integrity and less elasticity of that connective tissue, since you either aren't producing as much fibrillin or the fibrillin you are producing isn't functioning the way it's supposed to. And so I didn't get to look through everyone's responses to part 3 yet. But so let's talk about what were some of the main pieces of information that you feel like you weren't aware of in the first couple of parts, or that you were surprised about when you saw it in part 3.
I think there was just a lot more like negative consequences that syndrome like could have, possibly, like the things with the eyes like coming out of your sockets or something like that. We're like, what the heck?
Not that intense, but yeah.
It just was like way worse than I thought it'd be.
Yeah, retinal detachment and dislocation of the lens because of the connective tissue that's supposed to be holding them in place. Yeah, anything else?
I guess I'm surprised. I don't know the statistics on how many people with this genetic error survive for how long. So I guess I was surprised that if it is common, I guess it's pretty uncommon. But if people who have it tend to survive for a while, then I'm shocked that that's the case, because it seems like something you would die from before you're even born. I don't know.
So why do you think that? And this could be a question for everyone along that thinking, if anyone was thinking the same thing, why would you expect Marfan syndrome to result in such an early death?
Because it's a problem with the growth hormones and the cell differentiation and I just feel like that a lot of like stuff could go wrong with that things could grow when they're not supposed to, and you just like that's an easy way to die from that. It seems like, at least.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I especially agree with the its role in differentiation, right? If growth factor is going crazy and that is going to affect how our cells differentiate into their tissues and into their organs, that could cause huge problems early on. So based on that, I'll pose another question to the entire class. Do we think this is a inheritable disorder, or do you think it is developed during one's lifetime? Oh, Constance, you're muted if you're responding to me.
I believe it's a genetic condition, and by and large, the individuals survive to adulthood and very often to reproduce. So I don't think that it is a recessive condition.
So yes, I do know it is dominant. So you only need one copy of the mutated version of the gene for it to be expressed. And then saw someone put in the chat something else, inheritable, if it's a gene malfunction or mutation. So that's something I want to talk about too. So I don't know the answer. I just Googled it. I don't know if this first answer is correct. It's from Johns Hopkins, so should be relatively reliable. But yes, it does seem that it is a congenital condition, meaning that the person would have it from birth. But I do want to clarify that just because a disorder stems from a genetic malfunction or genetic mutation, that does not guarantee that it is inheritable. And in fact, I think it's safe to say most of the time it is not inheritable, even if it is a genetic mutation. Because to be inheritable, that means it would have to be passed on to the egg cells or the sperm cells. And you only develop those reproductive cells in specific organs, right? And so unless that mutation is affecting the cells in those organs, that is not going to be passed on to the next generation, right? So you can develop mutations that lead to things like cancer, but most cancers are not genetic as far as being inheritable. They are not passed on from generation to generation because the mutations happening in my skin or my arm over here have nothing to do with the genes that are being used to produce my sperm cells. So something to keep in mind. And so going further on that point that you were bringing up, Ben, that you would expect this to be a much bigger issue early on than it is, I would agree. So I'm interested in that. And that could be kind of a homework prompt for you guys. I can't give points for it, but let's look into that, right? Let's discuss that again later, or in lab to see what you guys found, and I'll look into stuff too.
I just wonder how much of the incidence is due to spontaneous mutation versus inheritance.
That's a good question too. So let me write down some stuff. Let me write down these questions. Okay. So would you repeat what you said, Constance?
Well, I was saying that if a significant proportion of these patients did not inherit the mutation from a parent, then they probably developed it as a spontaneous mutation of the germ cells. And what incidence or proportion of our patients would be having Marfan's because of a spontaneous mutation versus an inheritable condition?
Yes, and that's another great thing to talk about as far as mutations and how widespread the effect is. Right? So it could be inherited, which would mean every single cell in the body would be carrying that mutation because all the bodies in all the cells in our body come from the first cell when the father's sperm and the mother's egg combine their chromosomes. So any mutation that was in that first cell would be passed on to every other cell. But it could also develop early on pre-differentiation when your cells are still in the stem cell phase, the embryonic stem cell phase, and haven't differentiated to particular cell types, and thus would still be quite widespread because those cells are going to become multiple different tissues.
And because it is a dominant form of inheritance, it suggests that the parent can be heterozygous, in which only 50% of their offsprings would inherit that gene.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So trying not to get into, or trying to avoid getting into too much of the particulars of meiosis and genetic ratios and probabilities. But yes, because it is dominant, it is only carried, or it could only be carried on one of the two chromosomes that each individual has for that gene. And since each of your sex cells, whether it's an egg or a sperm, only carries one of your sets of chromosomes, not both, then the offspring would have a 50% chance of carrying that gene or inheriting that gene as well.
And dominant inheritance tends to not be lethal, at least until reproductive age group.
Yeah, and so why might that be logically? Or I want to pose that to the class. Why would a dominant gene typically not be lethal, even if it produces such significant defects like with Marfan syndrome?
Because it wouldn't be able to get replicated.
Yeah, right. If it was lethal, no one that had it would survive, and thus it isn't being passed on. Cool. Okay, was there anything else about this, either the case study, about Marfan syndrome itself, the symptoms that you guys wanted to talk about or discuss these last 10 minutes or so?
Is there a certain demographic that is more susceptible to Marfan syndrome?
Another good question. Any ideas just logically? Like, would you expect one demographic or another, or a certain characteristic to play a role in that? I guess tall people, but is tall the product or the yeah, you know what I mean?
The only thing I can say in my years of clinical practice in Southeast Asia, I've never seen a case of Marfan syndrome.
Okay. Yeah, the Johns Hopkins article, or not the Johns Hopkins article, the CDC puts the rate at 1 in 5,000 people. So very rare. Yeah. So I don't know. Like I said, I'm gonna look into these questions. So we have how do patients suffering from Marfan syndrome survive as long as they do? It seems like it should be quite debilitating and should be lethal. What is the prevalence rate as far as this being inherited or developed during that person's life during that person's life? And then is there a particular demographic that increases their susceptibility to this syndrome, to this disease? But yeah, if any of you feel so inspired to research that stuff too, please do, so we can have a bit more of a discussion about it. And yeah, so I think that was all for today. So I will take a look at what you guys thought as far as a response to question 4. But in general, if you guys appreciate this kind of practice, I'll continue looking for opportunities to put time into developing these. I spent most of this morning making this. So it does take a good amount of time, but then I get to use it again and again. So it's not a bad use of my time. So just let me know if we don't really like it or would rather spend time with the opportunity for review and questions about lecture content. We can spend class days that way too. So like I said, in the future, if we're wrapping up a Tuesday lecture and we've gotten through the entire PowerPoint, I'll have you guys respond to a quick poll before you leave asking what you would like the next class to look like. And that is how I will plan around this stuff. So yeah, any other questions, concerns, or comments for today before you guys leave me for the weekend? Alrighty. So next week on Monday in lab, we are wrapping up the appendicular skeleton, looking at the pelvic girdle and leg. On Wednesday, we will have our lecture exam the exam for the unit 1 content for lecture. That'll be on Wednesday. For our Zoom meetings, we're going to start with chapter 5. So the stuff we're covering in the lecture in Zoom next week is for unit 2. So we have wrapped up everything on unit 1. That is chapter 2, which is chemistry for anatomy and physiology, chapter 3, which is cell bio, and then chapter 4, which is our tissues of the body. So that is all that will be on the lecture content, and then lab exam will be on the skeleton, and that will be the following Monday, January 29th. So just keep that stuff in mind. Make sure you're studying, practicing, using those materials, and reach out with any questions and concerns. Other than that, I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday.
Wait, can I ask one thing? One thing really fast.
Please do.
Just to make sure, you say Tuesday is not the exam day. Wednesday is, and it's at 2 p.m. in the same 306 building.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we will take all of our exams in lab on a lab day. The only exception to that is
Wednesday is a lab day. I
Yeah.
forgot it wasn't Tuesday.
Yeah, the only exception to that is the final exam. Based on the final exam scheduler for the college, we are scheduled to have our final exam on a Tuesday. So that will also be in the lab in person, but it's on Tuesday, March 19th instead of a Wednesday or Monday. But yeah. Cool. So yeah, unless anyone else has a question, you guys are free to go. See you Monday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Rob.
Justin.
He's gonna